Welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak from India. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Martha Olney, teaching Professor Emerita in the Economics department at the University of California, Berkeley, as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Dr. Martha has built an exceptional career as a leading historian of the US economy, an acclaimed classroom teacher, and a devoted mentor to generations of students. She joined Berkeley in the early 90s after earning tenure at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and went on to hold a series of teaching appointments before being promoted to teaching professor. Over 3 decades at Berkeley, she played a central role in undergraduate education, including nearly a decade leading the department's undergraduate committee and many years convening the economic history launches that brought together graduate students and faculty for research discussion and community building. Her teaching portfolio has also extended beyond Berkeley, with visiting appointments at Stanford University and Siena College, reflecting a long-standing commitment to engaging diverse student audiences in economics. Professor Martha's contributions have been recognized with numerous honors for excellence in teaching and mentoring from UC Berkeley, the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Phi Beta Kappa, America's most prestigious academic honor society, the Economic History Association, the Star Ross, Center for Economic Education, and UC Berkeley's Faculty Award for Outstanding Mentorship of Graduate Students Instructors. She is actively involved in the economics profession through memberships in major scholarly associations and leadership roles on boards and committees focused on teaching professional climate and broadening participation in economics, including service on the national committees dedicated to supporting women, LGBTQD economists, and aspiring high school and undergraduate students in the field. In today's episode, Dr. Martha discusses key ideas from her acclaimed book, Inflation, an engaging and accessible guide to what drives rising prices and which policies can help bring the cost of living under control. The book is published as part of the MIT Press Essential Knowledge series. It's my pleasure to now welcome Dr. Martha Olney to the conversation. Dr. Martha, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation.
Professor, what prompted you to write a concise, accessible book about inflation now? And what did you hope readers would take away from it?
Well, what prompted me, frankly, was that they invited me to write the book. So it started with a conversation at one of the annual meetings with Emily Tabor, who was an editor at MIT Press at the time. And she invited me to write the book based on having heard me talk about issues related to inflation on various podcasts and here in the US. I was intrigued by the invitation and felt like I could really contribute. When I started looking to see what books were out there about inflation, there wasn't really anything like this book. There were several books that were trying to push a very political point of view. There were a couple books that were trying to push a religious point of view. There are certainly lots of things that are written for academics, but there wasn't anything for the general public. And there are so many times that members of your family or your neighbors or your friends will ask economists, oh, I just don't understand what's going on. Can you explain this Fed thing to me? Can you explain inflation to me? And I feel like we needed a book for the general public that tried to address those questions.
Professor, you begin by defining inflation and how it's measured. Could you walk us through the basics of what inflation actually captures and why the official numbers sometimes feel disconnected from what people experience at the grocery store or gas pumps?
So the basics of what the inflation rate measures, let me start there and then I'll get to the disconnect. There are several different inflation measures. The one that we hear most often is one that measures prices of goods that consumers buy, goods and services bought by consumers. Here in the US, it's the Consumer Price Index, or alternatively, the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index, the PCE. Those are gathered by two different government agencies, but should show broadly the same trends. There was a time, if any of the listeners took economics 10, 15, 20 years ago, there was a time when there could be quite a difference between those two indices. But they have changed the methodology by which they produce the CPI. So there's now very little difference between the two. In both cases, the index is measuring the typical goods and services that a consumer purchases. And so with the CPI, it's measuring a market basket of goods. So it's not based strictly on what people are actually purchasing in any given month, but what their pattern was in the previous year. With the personal consumption expenditures index, it is measuring what people are purchasing in any given month. But there's only that 1 year lag between the measure of what is being purchased. Are they measuring what was purchased a year ago, or are they measuring what was purchased now? And the challenges to the inflation. I forgot. Let me finish. So this comes up with something that's called either consumer price index or the personal consumption expenditures price index. And then the inflation rate gives us the percentage change from year to year in the value of this index. If the inflation rate is 10%, then prices are increasing really fast. If the inflation rate is 2%, then prices are increasing, but more slowly. If the inflation rate is 0, prices are holding steady. And if the inflation rate is negative, then prices are going back down to some level they held before. One of the confusions, which might be a disconnect, but one of the confusions that we see a lot is people who think that when the inflation rate comes down, that means prices will come down. But that's not right. That when the inflation rate comes down, the prices are still increasing. They're just not increasing as fast as they were before. They're increasing at a slower rate, but they're not back here where they started. Still moving up. The disconnect comes from several sources. One is that we're heavily influenced in our perception of what's happening to prices by the things that we buy most often and by the prices that we see. In the US, you see the prices of gasoline, because at gas stations, the prices are right there on a huge sign on the corner, and they're really, really big signs. So you see those prices very often. And so the price of gasoline has an over-influence, I should say, I guess, excessive influence on what we think is happening to inflation. If the price of gasoline goes from, and we measure it here in gallons, if it goes from $3 a gallon to $4 a gallon, which would be a 33% increase, oh my goodness, the inflation rate must be really high based on that one number. The price of gasoline goes down from $4 to $3.50 a gallon, and people start to feel a little bit better. So one thing that influences it and has an outsized influence are these prices that we see advertised. The other thing that influences what we think the inflation rate is the prices of things we buy quite often, and that tends to be food, whether it's food in the grocery store or food in restaurants. And there are some goods that we buy quite often. So, you may buy half a gallon of milk a week. You may buy a dozen eggs every 10 days. And so you have a sense of what, when you go to buy a dozen eggs and all of a sudden it's $7 instead of, wait, I think this used to be $3. And so there are goods like that we buy quite often. And so the first disconnect, I think, comes from the fact that the price index is measuring all of these goods and services that we buy over the course of a year, but our experience is with a very small subset of those things. So that's the first piece. The second piece is that the price index that's published is measured based on the typical spending patterns in the US of an urban family of 4. Well, there is no typical urban family of 4. The patterns of what people buy vary based on how big the family is, based on how much income the family has, based on where the family is located. So a farm family in the in the rural part of the country, is going to be buying a very different basket of goods from a senior who lives in an urban setting. And so the inflation rate that an individual experiences could well be quite different from what's the published inflation rate, because the basket of goods that they are buying is quite different than that typical urban basket of four.
Professor, your second chapter traces historical patterns of inflation. Which periods or episodes from the distant past to recent years do you consider most instructive for understanding today's price pressures?
So what's interesting is if you look at the picture in the book, I'll show it this way. I can also share my screen because I have it pulled up so I can share the screen. But
Sure.
but there's a graph in the book. There it is, which is a graph of inflation over the last 100+ years. And in the United States, and this was also the case in many other countries, not all other countries, but many other countries, in the United States, the inflation that we experienced after COVID was not unprecedented, but had not been experienced to that extent for over 40 years. So the last time we had quite high inflation had been in the 1980s. That means that if you figure that people don't really pay a lot of attention to the economy until they're maybe 14, 15, 16 years old, that anyone who was born after, say, 1964 had no lived knowledge, no lived experience, no knowledge of, because they don't, we're not going to count when they're kids, had no memory, let's say, of any inflation that was as high as it was after COVID. So from the perspective of academics, from the perspective of policymakers, the 1980s was the last time we had inflation as high in the United States as we had after COVID. From the perspective of people living through it, for many people, anybody who was born after 1964, this was indeed unprecedented. There had been nothing like this in their lifetime. The 1980s experience was instructive in the sense that we saw what kind of disruptions happened when there was very high inflation. We saw that it impacted different types of families differently. We saw that there were political impacts of quite high inflation, that there were psychological, emotional impacts of quite high inflation. But it was not instructive in the sense of how strong of a policy reaction is it going to take to address the inflation. The world has changed a lot over the last 40 years since the last time we experienced quite high inflation. And the understanding of what makes policy effective has changed a lot over the last 40 years. The structure of the economy has changed a lot over the last 40 years. And so in the sense of the 1980s were instructive in terms of this was the last time we had high inflation, but nothing was instructive in terms of the last time we had high inflation and addressed it with policy the way we would today.
Professor, in the chapter on what causes inflation, you distinguish between different sources of price increases. Can you explain the key drivers, whether supply shocks, demand surges, or policy choices, and how they interact in practice?
So I think, and I argue in the book, that the best way to make sense of inflation is to go back to the basic model of supply and demand that we teach in all Econ 1 courses. And for people who are watching the podcast as opposed to listening to it, that's the one with the supply and demand graph with the big X, right? And it's got a downward sloping demand curve that reflects what quantities people are willing to buy at various prices. It's got an upward sloping supply curve that reflects what quantities sellers are willing to supply at various prices. And the forces that cause prices to rise are either something that causes demand to increase or something that causes supply to decrease. If we're trying to understand a particular economic historical period, then we can go back and do our study of history, and figure out what was the context and what was going on to cause the inflation in that time period. Right? So if we're trying to understand the post-COVID inflation, we had a whole lot of things that went on at once. So here in the United States, we had We had an immediate shutdown in March of 2020 when interest rates were lowered to 0. We had very generous fiscal policy that replaced all of the lost income and more for people who were not working. That very generous fiscal policy allowed a lot of people to clean up their credit card debt and allowed them to put away savings, right? So put money away in savings. But the other thing that happened was that a lot of us all of a sudden were working from home, which we had never done before. And we didn't have ring lights, and we didn't have proper webcams, and we didn't have proper headsets, and we didn't have all of the equipment that we now have. And so there was, as you know, a surge in demand for electronics equipment to enable people to work from home. There was also a surge in demand for elastic waistband pants because you didn't have to dress up anymore and nobody could see you below the waist. So comfortable pants also, there was a surge in demand for that. And not much demand for things like makeup and high heels and sorts of things that you didn't need anymore because people were working from home. The shifts in demand, that alone was going to put upward pressure on some prices. But those shifts in demand, the generous fiscal policy was temporary. Oh my gosh, I have to have a ring light, I have to have a webcam. That's temporary because once you buy your ring light and your good webcam, you don't have to upgrade the ring light, and you probably should upgrade the webcam every few years because technology improves. But it was going to be a temporary surge in demand that would put upward pressure on prices, but should go away. The Federal Reserve referred to it as transitory as opposed to temporary. But transitory meant the same thing, that there was going to be an increase in prices that then was going to go away. On the supply side, the increase in demand for electronics coincided with the shutdowns around the world, which led to an absence of electronic chips that are necessary for making a lot of those electronics. And so that drove up the absence of chips, drove up the price of electronics. And even if there hadn't been an increase in demand, we would have had an increase in prices because of the shortage of supply of chips. The shutdowns around the globe meant that lots of goods that are usually shipped across the ocean, the parts for making things, were not being shipped. Those disruptions to supply, those supply shocks, should have been temporary. And that's, again, why the Fed was referring to it as a transitory price increase, because the impact of higher costs of production were related directly to the shutdowns. And to the extent that we could get the virus under control, so the shutdowns would dissipate, then the shutdowns ending would have eliminated these supply shocks. The price of containerized shipping would have gone back down to normal, as we have seen it did. The price of computer chips would have come back down. And those supply cost-induced increases in prices would have turned out to be temporary, or what they call transitory. So we had, in 2022, we had those two things going on at once, right? We had increases in demand from generous fiscal policy. We had shifts in what was being demanded because of the work from home change. And then we had the supply shocks that were increasing costs. We had increases in the US, we had increases in wages. For people who were going back to work in person, there was a demand for higher wages, that if you're going to make me put my life at risk to come to work, I would like to have a little more money, thank you very much. So compensated risk. And all of that was putting upward pressure on prices that the Fed thought would be transitory, temporary, would go away. Two things happened. The war in Ukraine began, and that led to disruptions in energy markets and in wheat markets, which put upward pressure on energy prices and on food prices. So great, we have a vaccine, people can start to go back to work, all of these disruptions should be over. Oh no, now we have a war. It was possible for that to be another temporary increase in prices, but what happened in the meantime was people's expectations, their answer to the question of, what do you think the inflation rate is going to be next year? So it's a survey question. It's a survey group out of the University of Michigan that calls up a bunch of households every month and says, hey, what do you think the inflation rate is going to be over the next year? Asks them various other questions as well. And the answers to that question started to go up. So where inflationary expectations, what's your answer to the question, what do you think the inflation rate is going to be next year? Where inflationary expectations had been very, very stable for the previous 20 to 30 years, and had been stable for the first 12 months or so of COVID, because people believed this transitory, it's only temporary, things will get resolved, it's all going to get worked out soon, don't panic, we'll go back to normal, toilet paper will be back in supply, no need to worry. People had believed that, and their inflationary expectations reflected that. But then as this wore on and on and on, then those inflationary expectations started to rise. That was when the Fed particularly became concerned, because as inflationary expectations rise, that has the potential to lock in those price increases and to make the inflation rate rise as well. So,
Professor, the Phillips curve remains controversial among economists. How do you explain its relevance or limitations to readers who may be encountering the concept for the first time?
I have to say the Phillips curve chapter was the hardest chapter to write. The Phillips curve, the notion of the Phillips curve is that there is a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. That when the unemployment rate goes down, the inflation rate goes up. When the unemployment rate goes up, when more people are out of work, the inflation rate goes down. You can also think of it as when the inflation rate goes up, there are forces that cause unemployment to go down and so on. But there tends to be this inverse relationship that when one of inflation or unemployment goes up, the other one goes down. The early Phillips curve back in the 1960s was a very naive Phillips curve. And I quote from the original article in the book, where the economists who were pushing this concept, it had been developed by Mr. Phillips, Professor Phillips, in the 1950s, and he had used data for the United Kingdom, looking at wages and employment. And then they came up with what I call the US version of the Phillips curve in the early 1960s. And they looked at not wage inflation, but price inflation and unemployment. And in the paper, in the article where the US Phillips curve is presented, they present the picture of the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And they say, this represents the, quote, menu of choice between unemployment and inflation. And the notion was, here's this one graph, and it has these particular points on it. And the president can say to their economic advisors, I would like the economy to be right here on the graph. This is, okay, those are my choices. I choose point B on the graph. And then the advisors would construct policy so as to manipulate the economy and move the economy to wherever point B happened to be. Very quickly, it became apparent that this relationship was not always fixed in one place. It could shift. It could shift up. It could shift down. And then ultimately, it also became apparent that the slope of this thing could change. It could be relatively steep. It could be relatively flat. And the slope of it could change over time as circumstances change. And I run through some of the details of that in the book. I think many of the objections, I think there are two sets of objections to the Phillips curve. I think one set of objections to the Phillips curve is almost a straw man argument where we are criticizing the Phillips curve without allowing for there to be shifts in the Phillips curve as we would allow in any other curve in economics, right? There's no other time in economics where we expect something to be always in the same position. Supply and demand curves shift all the time. The second challenge to the Phillips curve comes from the fact that the Phillips curve does shift and does twist, means that it's almost impossible to use it for setting policy. If your policy is the thing that makes the relationship between unemployment and inflation change, then, and you don't know precisely what the changes will be in reaction to your policy, then you can't use your policy to try to achieve a particular unemployment and inflation rate, because that point B on the graph that the president said, go for that point right there, well, that's no longer going to be one of the menu of choice. And because of the act of doing policy. So that is a long answer to why it was like, oh, how am I going to write this? And how am I going to write this for the general public? The chapter is half as long as it was in its first draft. I think it's still probably way too detailed for the general public. And the challenge, it was sort of a challenge of, I could probably do it in 2 pages, or I could do it in 20-ish pages. And I went with 20-ish pages. And I went with 20-ish pages because when you listen to what the Federal Reserve officials say, they talk about the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. And I felt like it was important for people who are reading the book as a way to try to understand the officials and what they're saying when they are setting policy. I thought it was important to have the Phillips curve background to see where this language of trade-off between unemployment and inflation came from. So that's why it was included. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, Professor.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Martha, you discuss anti-inflation policy in detail. When inflation rises, what tools are actually available to policymakers, and how do you assess their effectiveness and trade-offs?
In normal times, so the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2009 was not normal times. In normal times, the policy tool that's available to policymakers is changing interest rates. The policymakers have the ability to control, depending upon what country we're talking about, 1, 2, or 3 interest rates. And then the markets, the rest of the world that are buying and selling financial assets, the markets determine what's happening to other interest rates. There are so many. Where to start? The way it's supposed to work, let me start there. The way it's supposed to work is this. So there is inflation. The Fed says, oh, there's inflation. The way to get the inflation rate down is to lower demand, because higher demand pushes prices up, lower demand has the opposite effect. So if we want to slow the rate of inflation, we should slow demand. If we want to slow demand, we could do that by making it more expensive for businesses and people to borrow money, thus raising the interest rates. And then that would lead to a reduction in spending on debt-financed goods and services. I don't know how many services are debt-financed, but debt-financed goods. And that would lead to a slowdown in the economy to take pressure off of prices and presumably lower that inflation rate. Okay, sounds great. The challenge is, there's so many challenges. One is, as we said earlier, inflation is not only caused by demand, inflation is caused by supply shocks as well. And so if the inflation is a result of a supply shock, then lowering demand doesn't address the problem that created the inflation in the first place. Lowering demand or slowing the growth of demand throws people out of work. I mean, the whole thing here is what are we doing? We're trying, there we're back to this Phillips curve trade-off, right? We are creating circumstances that lead to layoffs and lead to people losing their jobs in order to slow demand for goods and services, slow the growth of demand for goods and services, in order to take pressure off of prices, in order to hopefully slow the inflation rate so that prices are going up slowly instead of really rapidly. The ability, I said that the 1980s were instructive in terms of the inflation rate was equally high, but not terribly instructive in terms of policy. In the United States, between 1980 and today, There's been a tremendous rise in the share of services that are produced and consumed in the economy, and a tremendous drop in the share of goods that are produced and consumed in this economy. And so when interest rates are increased, an increase in interest rates is designed to make it more expensive to borrow money to buy debt, to do debt financed consumption. Well, debt financed consumption tends to be consumption of goods. But an increasing share, more than half of the economy in the United States, is services. Very much different than what was the case in 1980. And so there's a smaller share of the economy that is even susceptible to increases in interest rates than was the case 40 years ago when we had the prior inflation. So that's another challenge. The Fed, the central bank in any country, doesn't control all interest rates. In all countries, in most all countries, the central bank controls a short-term interest rate. There's a few countries that have a long-term interest rate as well. But in almost all countries, the central bank controls a short-term interest rate. It could be an overnight interest rate. It could be a 3-month interest rate, but typically no longer than 3 months. And then the markets are the ones that determine what's going to happen with the 3-year and the 10-year and the 30-year interest rates. If the determination of what's going to happen to long-term interest rates, the 30-year, the 10-year interest rates, that's a reflection of what the people in financial markets, the traders, that's a reflection of what the people in financial markets think short-term interest rates are going to be over the next 10 years. So how much it costs to borrow today and pay it back over 2025 to 2035, a 10-year loan. How much it costs today to borrow over a 10-year period depends in part on what the lenders think will be the 3-month interest rate in 2030, 2031, 2032, 2033, 2034, 2035, and so on. 2026 and 2027. If the central bank is trying to increase interest rates and the trading public thinks, they don't really have the heart for this. They're going to increase interest rates today, but they're going to reverse course soon, and they're going to bring interest rates down by the end of the year. They're under political pressure, they're under economic pressure, whatever the case may be. They're going to lower interest rates really soon. Then those long-term interest rates will not rise very much. And it's not the 3-month interest rate that controls the debt finance spending. It's the 5-year and 10-year interest rate that control the debt finance spending. So another challenge that the central bank faces is that they can change these short-term interest rates, but the long-term interest rate is the one that matters to spending, and they may not be able to make that one change. That's up to the markets. The ability of the central bank to influence behavior and to influence these expectations about interest rates, which changes interest rates today, depends upon the credibility of the Fed. And this is one of the big changes from 1980s, right? So when we were conducting policy in the 1980s, the prevailing theory about what made monetary policy effective was monetary policy would be effective in changing behavior if it was a complete surprise, right? If it was like, somebody jumping out of the closet and yelling boo and scaring the bejesus out of you, right? That if the central bank changed policy in a way that nobody expected them to do, then it would be effective. But if the central bank simply increased interest rates in the way that people expected them to increase interest rates, then that behavior by the central bank would have already been taken into account. And them doing what everyone expected them to do would have no impact on behavior because they were simply doing what they had been expected to do. And so in the 1980s, they thought they needed to be big and bold and surprising. And that's why the interest rates in 1980, when they increased interest rates to try to beat the inflation out of the economy, they increased them from a norm in the US of 3 to 6% up to 18%. Those were huge increases in the United States for interest rates. Today, the notion is the Fed needs to be transparent and it needs to be credible. The central bank people should be able to predict what the central bank is going to do. And the central bank should say, this is what we're going to do. These are the circumstances under which we'll raise interest rates. These are the circumstances under which we'll decrease rates. And then they should stick to that. So they should be transparent in what they're planning to do. And they should be credible in the sense that they stick to what they're planning to do. And that if the central bank is both transparent and credible, then they can be effective in trying to manipulate the economy. So that piece, did they lose credibility when they said that the inflation was going to be temporary and then it turned out not to be temporary and it was greater than what they thought it was going to be? Perhaps. Did they lose credibility with the bond traders? Probably not. Did they lose credibility with the general public? Perhaps. And the general public, oh, now we're back to people's answer to that question of what do you think the inflation rate is going to be? So if the Fed says, and here's part of their credibility piece again, if the Fed says, we're going to increase interest rates and we're going to fight this inflation and we're going to do what it takes in order to bring this inflation down and you can trust us. If they have credibility, that statement alone will lower inflationary expectations. It'll mean people will answer that question of what do you think the inflation rate is going to be next year? With, yeah, I don't know. I was really worried it was going to be 5, but now I think it's going to be 3 because the Fed's on the job. And so the credibility and transparency matters both to bond traders who know a lot about financial markets, but it matters to normal people, you and me, because it's going to influence our expectations, our hunches of what the inflation rate is going to be next year. So what are the trade-offs? The trade-offs, so that was a lot of caveats, right? That there is this plan, but there's a lot of things that have to go right for it to work. Now, the other piece is that and this gets back to the notion of the Phillips curve, the Federal Reserve has this one tool, which is changing interest rates. And if they increase interest rates, for instance, in order to fight inflation, that increase in interest rates, if everything works the way it's supposed to, that increase in interest rates is going to slow aggregate demand. It's going to throw people out of work. It's going to raise the unemployment rate. In the United States, the central bank operates with what's called a dual mandate. In some countries, they have I don't know what they call it if it's not dual, a 3-piece mandate. That includes exchange rates as well, but in the United States, it's a dual mandate, 2 things, which is price stability and maximum employment. And the central bank can use, if they need to fight inflation, they would fight inflation by raising interest rates, acknowledging that would probably slow employment growth. If they need to fight an unemployment problem, they would fight an unemployment problem by lowering interest rates, acknowledging that would probably make the price inflation rate go up a little bit. And so they have these trade-offs, right? So you're going to fight inflation, acknowledging that's going to slow the economy and that may slow employment growth, may even raise unemployment depending on what's happening to the labor force. The super challenge that the central bank faces, and this is what's happening right now in December of 2025, the super challenge is when they need to fight both inflation and unemployment at the same time. So that has been called stagflation since the 1970s. So the economy is stagnating because the total output GDP is not growing very quickly, but there's inflation. So stagnation plus inflation gives you stagflation. When there's high inflation that the central bank wants to fight, and when there's an unemployment problem or slow growth that the central bank wants to fight, they can't do both at the same time. The policy for fighting inflation makes growth worse. The policy for fighting slow growth makes inflation worse. And so when they're in that position, they have to make a decision. They have to choose which of those 2 problems they're going to fight. And how hard. that's when it starts to really matter who are the decision makers at the central bank. So in the United States, with the Federal Reserve, the Federal Open Market Committee is the organization, is the group, is the committee that makes decisions about what's going to happen to interest rates. There's 12 people on that committee. There's the chairman, who today is Jay Powell. There's the 6 other members of the Federal Reserve Board. There's the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which is currently John Williams. And then there are 4 of the other 11 regional bank presidents. Those 12 people get to vote. They are going in today's, actually, the meeting, I think, started today. Yes, today's the 9th. So they're in a meeting. They're in their hotel rooms right now. Hopefully they're asleep, but they're probably not. They're in their hotel rooms right now in Washington, D.C. They've had one day of the meeting. They'll have another day tomorrow. And in this meeting that they are in the middle of, each of the bank presidents presents a report on economic conditions in their region. Now, normally what happens is they have a lot of government data, official government data to look at to assess what's happening in the economy. We had in the United States, our federal government was shut down for 6 weeks, and the data that the FOMC would normally have to look at is simply not available. Those data were not produced. So they're kind of flying blind at this point, or as somebody described it, they're driving in a very thick fog. And the other problem is, even if they had really good data, they have data about what happened last month and the month before, but they're really trying to predict how changes in inflation rates will impact what's going to happen to the economy in January, February, March, April, and May in the future. So these 12 people are in a difficult position right now at this meeting. 1, they don't have very good data. 2, they're trying to predict the future. Not really, the fact they don't have good data is about the past. They're trying to predict the future. Even if we had really good data is never very good at identifying turning points when we're going from unemployment is going down to unemployment is going up, or the reverse. And then we've got these 12 individuals who are not all the same. And some of them believe that the inflation problem is the most important problem to address. We would call those hawks. And some of them believe that the inflation problem is an important problem to address, but we also need to take into account the human cost of unemployment. And we would call those doves. And that balance of hawks and doves on the FOMC is really going to impact what the vote is tomorrow for whether they're going to cut interest rates or leave them the same. They won't increase them. They will either cut them or leave them the same. I think the prediction is that they're going to cut by a 1/4 point. So we'll see. By the time this podcast comes out, it'll be long since history. But that's the challenge they face right now, is that they have to choose which problem to fight aggressively right now, because they can't fight both.
Professor, beyond the obvious rise in prices, you highlight a subtle effect, the decrease in quality or quantity of goods and services. Could you share examples of how inflation manifests in ways that standard measures might miss?
So they call this hidden inflation, and it comes largely in 2 forms. One is the shrinkage of products, and the other is changes in quality. My next door neighbor was talking to me last night, and she said that they went out for breakfast the other day and realized that their standard breakfast was now 2 eggs instead of 3, and 2 pieces of bacon instead of 3, and 1 something else. I forget what else was in the breakfast. Let's say 1 piece of fruit instead of 2. And it was still the same price. And so she laughed and pointed out to her husband, she says, this is exactly what our neighbor talks about in her book. That this is an example of inflation, that even though the price is still the same, we're getting less food. And so that's a hidden inflation. So some other standard examples, candy bars are much smaller than they were in the past. In the United States, a standard bag of sugar used to be 5 pounds and now it's 4. It's very odd. And other things like that, where it's the same price, but you're getting less. Then the other type of hidden inflation is quality differences. Things that break down more easily than they used to. And I'm sitting here, I'm looking at my printer. The laser printer I had, it lasted me a good 15 years. But when that laser printer finally broke and I had to buy an inkjet printer, these things seem to break after about 3 years. So it may seem like it was less expensive to begin with, but I have to buy them much more often. And other examples like that. So the quality of things going down.
Professor, the book mentions everyday experiences like the price of X or a tank of gas to illustrate inflation's sting. How do you connect these personal examples to the broader macroeconomic story you tell?
Well, that's actually I suppose that's a reflection of my teaching style. Is that I've always felt like, well, it's a reflection of my teaching style, and it's a reflection of how I've always approached macroeconomics. I remember when I was a graduate student, and the professor was talking about increases in the amount of money in the economy would make the inflation rate go up. And I raised my hand and asked a question. And I said, I don't get it. Can you explain to me why more money in the economy makes the baker charge more for the loaf of bread that I buy at the bakery? I mean, well, and he would give some abstract answer. And I said, no. Tell me a story that helps me to be in that person's shoes and raising the price that I'm charging for a loaf of bread, and help me trace that back to what you're saying is the impetus. And that was always the way I learned, was by the abstract parts didn't make as much sense to me unless I could trace it back and understand it in very concrete kinds of terms. And so it turned out to be the way that I taught. So that when I teach macroeconomics, it's important to me that people understand macro not as an abstract set of equations, but as something that impacts our lives and that is part of our lives. And so, inflation, and the measure of inflation takes into account much more than eggs in a tank of gas. But we can understand inflation by thinking about what's happened to eggs. And we can understand inflation by thinking about what happens to the price of gas. So I think it's as much a teaching strategy to help, in my mind, to help people understand.
Professor, if you could distill the essential message of your book for someone who wants to understand inflation but feels overwhelmed by the technical jargon, what would it be?
I should have a good answer to this question, and I don't know that I do yet. So I think it's probably still too complicated of an answer. So let me tell you what I think it is. I think the answer is inflation refers to how quickly prices are going up. But when the inflation rate is lower, that doesn't mean prices are going back down. It means they're still going up. The experience of inflation is not unique to any one country. And there are things that have happened, like COVID, that impacted countries all around the world. The oil crisis of the 1970s impacted countries all around the world. And that particularly, I think this is a US message, I think for people who have a parochial, I think the US is all there is that I need to look at, that they should open that up a little bit and realize that the US is part of a world economy, and that what happens here is not exclusive to the United States, which also means that the solutions don't necessarily need to be exclusive to the United States. I think that generally, there's a lot of stuff that can make prices go up faster. So there's a lot of stuff that can make the inflation rate go up, a lot of stuff that can make the inflation rate go down. And we are, as economists, still trying to come up with a story that we all buy into. So it probably, in the end, will have something to do with supply and demand and expectations. But the way that science and knowledge works is that we're still asking questions and we're still developing answers, and that's okay. That the Fed can't sit back and wait. The central banks can't wait 55 years for the economists, the academic economists, to figure something out. They've got to do policy now. And so they're doing policy the best they can. It's science, but it's art as well. It's influenced by what their goals are for the economy. And they are making decisions today that are about what's going to happen in the future, but they don't have a crystal ball to tell them what's going to happen in the future. So a little bit of grace would probably be called for. There's always more to learn. So that's a long answer. But I think that's the answer.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking ahead, what do you see as the most important questions or challenges for managing inflation in the coming years? And what role should public understanding play in shaping better policy decisions?
In the United States, I think probably the most important issue is the independence of the central bank. The central bank is traditionally, and to my mind, should be free of political influence. That in the countries around the world where the central bank has been co-opted by the executive branch, we see what happens is that's a recipe for economic disaster. I mean, the worst case disaster would be a hyperinflation. We would hope that it wouldn't get that bad. But even in the 1970s, when President Richard Nixon and Fed Chair Arthur Burns were kind of in, I don't want to say cahoots, but cooperating, let's say, that's one piece that might have led to the much higher inflation that we had in the 1970s than we'd had previously. So I think the independence of the central bank is right now the number one issue. And I think for me, that dominates any particularities about whether they increase interest rates or decrease interest rates or prioritize inflation or prioritize the growth of the economy. My sense is that it's not just in the United States where the independence of the central bank is an issue right now. So I think that's an issue in many countries and is important. If the central bank becomes co-opted by the executive branch, then then we just throw the book away. Because all of the discussion about anti-inflation policy becomes irrelevant. And if it becomes co-opted by the executive branch, and if the executive branch is in office through one means or another with the agreement of the people, then interest rate policy will be conducted as part of a popularity contest and not part of what's best for the economy.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Martha Olney. Your insights into inflation from its historical patterns to the real-world impact on everyday life have given our listeners a much clearer understanding of this crucial economic challenge. We are grateful for the clarity you bring to complex topics and for your dedication to making economics accessible to everyone. Your book, Inflation, is essential reading for anyone wanting to understand the forces shaping our economy and what we can do about it. We hope our audience will seek it out and continue these important conversations. Dr. Martha, thank you once again for being with us and offering such clear and timely reflections on inflation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for the invitation.